Okay, well, it is time to get going. For those of you that have not been in this class so far, what we've been doing is going through some question and answers that people have submitted to me over the last little while. Today's a question that has been submitted to me, I think, by 3 different people. One for this class and 2 various other times in the recent near past. But it's a question that I think is really good. And for those of you that this may be a little bit of a niche topic tonight, and I think we're also going to spend next week talking about it too, just because it's too big a topic just for one class. And so I know that this is going to be kind of odd for some of you, especially those of you that may be new to the church and maybe a little bit of a different class. But today we're going to talk about non-institutionalism. And you may be saying, well, what on earth is that? And that's probably a good question. Today, it is not nearly as big of an issue as this was back in my granddad's generation. But it is still an issue, and it is an issue that has ramifications that are still being felt today. In Ray County, how many churches of Christ are there? There's us, there's Graysville, there's Spring City, and then there's Ray Church of Christ. Well, we do a lot with Graysville. We go to their Ladies' Day. They come to our stuff, and we've got a good relationship there. And Spring City, I know a lot of you guys grew up going to Spring City, and pretty good relationship there. But what do you know about the other Ray Church of Christ? Why don't we talk to them and do things with? So that's what we're talking about today. So we talk about non-institutionalism. Just to kind of understand our terms, this is a topic, and I'll talk more about this in a minute. This is a topic that is very contentious in these discussions that have happened. There have been a lot of hurt feelings and a lot of people that have acted in ways that they really shouldn't have acted. And because of that, there's a lot of bad feelings here. And so I'm going to try and talk about this in a good way, a productive way, because I think it is a problem and it needs to be addressed. And so whether you know it or not, you probably have had some part of this discussion in maybe some of your travels, going to places, to church and that sort of thing. We would be what would be considered an institutional church. We write checks. We had our budget report last Sunday, right? And if you look through it, we support a lot of missionaries, right? And we support a lot of, yesterday, Tennessee Children's or Potter's Children's Home came by, and we supported them, and we support them every month, and we support the Tennessee Children's Home. We support Freed Hardman and various other Christian colleges. Those are institutions, right? Those are institutions that are outside of the church. Non-institutional churches would not do that. And that's really the crux of the issue. And we'll talk about this more. But they would have a serious problem with that. And they would consider that support of those institutions, those extra biblical, extra church institutions, as sinful. And so oftentimes when we talk about, divides in the church, we talk about, the theologically liberal, the theologically conservative, and those words really are meaningless, conservative and liberal. It's all a matter of perspective. But they would be, non-institutional churches would be to our right, if you want to think about it in that way. And so the Ray Church of Christ is a non-institutional church, and they're very open about that and very clear about that. So let's just kind of have a brief history here about how all this goes down. So, we are the Church of Christ. We take that name because that's what we want to be, right? We want to be a restoration of the church that Christ established. And we understand that there have been a lot of perversions that have happened to the church throughout history, human history. So in the 1790s, rather, the American Restoration movement began with some figures that you probably have heard of, Campbell, Stone, all those people. And their whole goal, and I think is a good goal, is we want to go back to the way that things once were originally, before all these other inventions and corruptions snuck into the church. And so that's their movement, and I think it's a very good movement, and it's a lot of things I agree with very strongly. Well, in 1906, we talked about this in our class a little while ago. There was a big division between Churches of Christ and the Christian Church, or Disciples of Christ group, over instrumental music and missionary societies and various of those things. There's a big split. Churches of Christ being the group that holds to what the American Restoration movement had always taught, and I think what the Bible teaches. I would say the Christian church is a departure from that. Well, in the 1960s, you have a softer division than that necessarily hard division between the institutional and non-institutional Churches of Christ. And so this was a big discussion that was going on in my granddad's era, and something that he dealt with a lot, and something that in certain pockets of the United States are a really big deal. This area of Tennessee is not as big of a thing. Where I grew up in Kentucky, it's a really big thing. I have a friend that was working at a church in North Carolina, this was a very big issue for them. About half of it's really an interesting situation. About half of their church would identify as non-institutional, and the other half wouldn't. And so there's a lot of interesting dynamics there. But in the 1960s, you have this split that begins to form by some big name people that, if you know some church history, you may recognize. G.C. Brewer, N.B. Hardman, B.C. Goodpasture. Those would be the, I'm going to use the term mainstream, institutional, I guess, churches would go after. We're kind of the representative of that. The non-institutional movement, you got people like Foy Wallace, Roy Cogdill, Fanning Taint, and people that you may or may not have heard of as much. So, why this divide? What do you all know about? Is this something that you're familiar with at all? Is this something you've heard of at all? What's the big deal? Why is there this division in your experience?
Well, it was a big deal with me because we had a family that attended here for a long time.
Sure.
And she decided that we should not support orphans.
Yeah.
And I disagreed.
Yeah.
And so we came to the building and we had us about an hour talk. And the bottom line is, I told her, I don't understand how you are opposed church providing money for orphanages if you weren't going to support an orphan yourself.
Yeah.
And she says, well, it's not required.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I know for a fact, and Patty talked about it right there, that this has been an issue that has affected this church in particular, right? And we want to be a unified church. We talked about that when we talked about fellowship a couple weeks ago. We want to be a church that's unified, because that's the church that Christ intended. You go through 1 Corinthians, Paul's begging them, be unified. And I think this is an issue because this has drawn a division in the church. And I understand what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about their perspective, the perspective of non-institutional churches. And then next week, we're going to address these issues. So I'm not going to give you all the answers that you may want today. We'll come back and give that to next week. I have some handouts that I'll give you for each week. And so any questions that you have, you can look at those. But it's an issue that's affected the church here. And we want to be unified. And this is a matter that's caused a lot of division. And we want to be theologically right? For the non-institutional, I think they're brothers, right? This is a matter of salvation, and this is a matter of being right with God. And so it's something they take very seriously, and something we should too. Because if they're right and we're wrong, we should be concerned, and we should adopt what's right and abandon wrong practices. And so that's the kind of the whole idea behind the restoration movement. I don't think that this is a correct position, just disclaimer, but it is something that we need to think about, because I would like to see restoration here. Churches come together on this issue, and there have been a lot of efforts very recently to mend this challenge, and I think some good stuff's coming in the future. I know Doug Burleson is one of my professors. He did a discussion with one of the leaders of non-institutionalism today, a guy by the name of Pope is his last name. I don't know his first name, but it was really good. And so there's discussions happening. There's effort to mend this division. But so anyway, when we think about the division, we think about the externals, right? What do you know about non-institutional churches? Well, some people will say, well, they don't support the orphans, and they don't support, they don't have a kitchen. And those are like the two things I hear more than anything else. They don't have kitchens, and they don't support orphans, and they don't support missionaries. And one, that's a misrepresentation, in part at least. And two, it's often said very dismissively, and I think that's not good either. But the externals are more of a manifestation of a more inward thing that's going on. And the more inward thing is that there's a discrepancy in interpretation. How do we interpret, and how do we come to right conclusions? So the real issue here, the other things are just externalities that come from this issue, is how do we interpret the Bible, and how do we determine what's authoritative and what in the Bible are things that we need to pattern our life after, and what are things that are circumstantial, what are things that are not authoritative. So just a little bit more, I think the result of all of this is we have kind of parallel brotherhoods going on. We share the same name, but we don't share fellowship. We have our schools, they have theirs. When we think about Church of Christ affiliated schools, Freed, where I went, you may think of Harding, you may think of Lipscomb, you may think of Heritage, you may think of Faulkner. There's a lot of those. They have their own, although they wouldn't say that exactly. Florida College, which is where my granddad actually went to school in Florida, is now a non-institutional church, and they have various other schools of preaching and things that you probably haven't heard of, because there's this divide here. We have our publications, they have theirs, and there's not much intermingling that goes on between those. So some thoughts. There's been a lot of unkindness. Let's be nice. People will often use the term, well, they're just antis. Don't use that term. It's offensive. So, people on our side of this very often will use the term anti-church because they're just against everything. Don't say that. It's offensive. They find it pejorative. And so if you want to have any effort of restoring some relationship, don't be calling people names. And so don't call them anti-churches. We need to treat each other like brothers. From our perspective, I think they're right with God, and I think we're right with God, and so I'm going to treat them like a brother. We're getting to it, Patty. But from their perspective, they think that we're erring brothers, and so they think we're erring, and I hope that they treat us like an erring brother. That's still a brother, but needs some correction, and so there's a different tone there. And finally, I think there's a lot to respect about the non-institutional churches. We often talk about, well, they don't support the that's not true. They do. They just do in a different way. And oftentimes, I think they do a lot better job at it than we do. We have, I should have brought the budget with me today, but our budget line item for John's got it. What's our budget for Tennessee Children's Home? Just off the top of your head, if you got it. $3,000. We spend $3,000 a year supporting Tennessee Children's Home. Is that a lot? No. We have about 120 members, 130 members or so. What if you divide 3,000 by 130, and then, every week too, right? What are we giving each week as individuals there? 44 cents, right? You think you could do a little bit better than 44 cents to support the orphans? I hope so, and I hope you are. And so, in a lot of ways, they don't do things the way we do it. Maybe they do it a little bit better. Maybe they give a little bit more percentage-wise, and I think there's a lot of respect for their conviction in this. And anyway, let's not be uncharitable to them. So, what do they believe? We talked about interpretive methods, which is the real core of it, and we'll talk more about this next week than we will today. But have you ever heard of Cine as a way to interpret the Bible? Okay. This is something that became really popular with a guy by the name of Thomas B. Warren, who was a very influential teacher in the 1950s and following years, decades. He was a philosopher, had some very influential debates, and what he does is it really create this. He mostly just names this way of interpreting the Bible. And Cine stands for command, example, necessary inference, which means if you see a command in the Bible, then you should do it today, right? When Jesus tells his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel, and that's a command that needs to be followed. There's examples in the Bible that need to be followed, and so sometimes you have examples of baptism, right? You look at the pattern of baptisms and conversions in the New Testament, and you see that not only is it commanded, but you see examples of it too. Every time somebody comes to believe, they're baptized, and so there's a pattern. You see this example that's set. Sometimes things that are authorized and you're allowed to do, are inferred. And so you have, God commands you to take the Lord's Supper, right? Well, he tells you to drink of the, fruit of the vine. Well, do you need a vessel to do that, right? Do you need, we're commanded to sing. And so we have song books to help facilitate that. And there's things you can infer from the text itself. So anyway, this is the core of non-institutional biblical interpretation methodology. And by and large, I think it's very good. I think there's some issues with it, and we'll talk about that next week, but 95% of this is good stuff. But the way that this has manifested and has impacted the church differently than we have, I think is they take it to an extreme in finding patterns. And so I think some people have called it hyper-patternism. They find examples and things that they find examples binding that perhaps shouldn't be binding. Some things are just descriptive. They're not prescriptive. And they just tell you what has happened. They're not telling you what you should be doing. And so that's where I think the real crux of this issue is what's binding and what's not. And in fact, Thomas B. Warren wrote a book about this called When is an Example Binding? So anyway, that's a lot of history for you. So let's get into what this actually practically looks like. And again, this is not the position I hold, but this is what non-institutional people hold based on some of their own writings. So this really is seen in three major ways. It's seen in how we approach evangelism. It's seen in how we approach benevolence, giving, and it's seen in how we approach edification, building each other up and that sort of thing. So regarding evangelism, non-institutional churches will say that no church has the right to receive funds from another church or give those funds to an evangelist working with them or other congregations. So what does that mean? We had last year, and I think 2 years before that, I can't remember his last name. We had the missionary from Nigeria come, right? I think it was Nigeria. And he gave a report. He's sponsored by the Willette Church of Christ. And so what we do is we give money to the Willette Church, and they collect money from all these other churches, and they send it to the missionary. I can't remember what his name is. And he does his mission work through that. And so rather than having, 30 sources of income coming in, the Willette Church gathers all of that, collects it, and then sends it. Non-institutional churches will say that that's wrong. And they'll say you shouldn't be doing that. And they have reasons. I think sometimes we treat this as totally irrational. So I can't imagine why they would say. They have reasons. And the reason is they see this as a violation of church autonomy. So when you look at 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2, Peter's talking to, let's just go ahead and read it. 1 Peter 5, 2. Peter says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly as God would have you. And he goes on. And so the authority of an eldership is over their congregation that is among them. What they see here is a violation of an eldership giving up their authority to another eldership, essentially becoming subservient, losing some of that autonomy in the way that this money is being handled. And so the church ought to be autonomous, which I agree with, but in this act, they're losing their autonomy. Because, who's to say once those funds are transferred to Willette, what if the check that I write to Willette goes into their bank account and those dollars are not spent on the missionary, and some other dollars are spent on the missionary. And so that's the problem here, one of the problems. The second reason why they say this is they see it as a violation of a pattern that you see in the Bible, in the New Testament, of sending money directly to individuals that are being sponsored. So they would not have a problem with sending money directly to a missionary, but they would have a problem with sending money to a church to send to a missionary. Does that make sense? And so when you look at 2 Corinthians, flip over there. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Look at verse 8. Paul's talking about the way his ministry has been facilitated. And in 2 Corinthians 11:8, he says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. Paul received his support from other churches, plural, right? You look at Philippians chapter 4, verses 14 through 18. So he says, yet it was kind of you to share my troubles, and you Philippians yourselves know that I am in the beginning of the gospel. When I left Macedonia, no church entered into a partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs and needs once and again. And so what Paul's saying is, when I was doing my missionary work in Macedonia, no church supported me, but you guys, you did. You guys sent me funds directly, giving me what I need. And so the church at Philippi sends money directly to him to facilitate his work. The church at Philippi does not, and never in the New Testament, this is rightful, this is accurate, never do you see Philippi send money to Thessalonica to send money to Paul. You don't see, the churches in Galatia gathering their money and sending that to Paul. And, there's a one church straight to Paul. And so they say that's the pattern for how we should operate today. And we should not send money to sponsoring churches to support evangelists. We should do it directly. So that's one major distinction. We got to move on. We're not going to get through all this. Another one is on benevolence. They say one church can only send benevolent funds to another church to bring about equity or equality, meaning mutual freedom from one. So what that means is if you have a church that has less, a church that has more can send funds to that church that has less to relieve them from, whatever they're lacking. And you see this in the Bible. You have in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, you have a famine that's going on in Jerusalem, and Paul encourages the church to send funds, a collection for the saints in Jerusalem, so that they can provide for what they need. The difference in this and the one before, they're just giving the church money to do as they see. They're not asking the church to facilitate something on their behalf. And so they say, well, this is totally fine because we're a more wealthy church giving to a needier church. We're supporting them and allowing them to do as they see fit with these funds. They're not an intermediary between us and somebody else. This also can be seen in, they say that the treasury, the church bank account, can only be used to benefit saints. You can't use money from the church treasury to help non-Christians. So there's a lot of reasons for this, but they say that all Christians have an obligation to help non-Christians. Go over to Galatians chapter 6. So in Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, so then as we have opportunity, let's do good to everyone, and especially to those who are the household of faith. And so they say that this is a individual command. All Christians have the obligation to do good to everybody. But for churches, churches are only able to pull money from the church treasury to spend on the saints. And so they draw a distinction there. So, if we have our giveaway day, for example, we buy a lot of chickens. They're still sitting out there for giveaway day. Those are purchased by the church to give oftentimes to a lot of people that aren't members of the church. They would say you can't do that. The church also here, we pretty often will help members of the church pay a water bill, pay rent or something like that. That happens every now and then. They say, well, that's fine because you're helping a member of the church from the church treasury. And so they draw that line there. And they say that there are no examples of churches in the New Testament giving financial aid to non-Christians. And so because there's no examples, we can't do that. They also say that the church cannot extend benevolence to any human organization, and this is where the orphanages come in. Orphanages, what do? They take care of orphans. Colleges, what do? They educate. And missionary society, well, I have some issues with missionary societies. They're beyond this, but what do? They support evangelism. And so they say you can't support those groups because what those groups are doing, they're outside of the church organizations that are doing what the things that churches should be doing. And so if you just give your money to an orphan home, you're not satisfying your obligation to give and care for the orphans that you read about in James. If you're just, giving money to a sponsoring church, you're not satisfying your obligation to go and evangelize. And if you're giving a check to Freed Hardman, you're not satisfying your obligation as a church to teach your children. And so they say a church cannot give out of the church treasury money to these outside organizations. As an individual, you can. As an individual, you can give money to orphan homes. You can give money to colleges. And Florida College is a college that's associated with Non-Institutional Churches of Christ. They're not sponsored. There's no non-institutional church giving a check to Florida College. There are lots of individual non-institutional Christians that do. You see that distinction? I know this is confusing and really niche, and some of you are like, well, I don't care about this. But this is, I think, something that needs to be discussed. But so, and then on the matter of edification, how churches operate and building each other up and fellowship, all that sort of thing, they say church funds can't be used on social affairs, social matters. And they call this the social gospel. And so because you should not be using money to facilitate social events, there's no need for kitchens, there's no need for fellowship halls, there's no need for all these, pizza parties like we did last Sunday. We're not spending money on those things. And they say, it's a social, they compare it to John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, Jesus feeds, one of those multitudes of people, and the people are following him because, well, not because they care about what he actually said, but because they just got their bellies full, right? And they say that if a church is to engage in this type of work, then they're just people pleasing, and it's this social gospel.
Jesus and his people pleasing ministry.
Yeah. And so their rationale, they say Paul makes a distinction between church and home. And they point to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul says, you guys are taking the Lord's Supper wrong. Some of you are just making the Lord's Supper into this common meal. You have your own homes to eat in. And so very often, not just very often, all non-institutional churches will say you can't eat in a church building. It's sinful to eat inside of a church building. They'll also say, term fellowship is not used for social matters in the New Testament. And they say this follows the pattern that you see. The term fellowship is used a lot in the New Testament, and when it's used in religious connotations. And so when we satisfy our fellowship obligation through spiritual things and not non-spiritual things. And so the church money can't be spent on non-spiritual things. And so a lot of this, we're out of time, but a lot of this really boils down to how is the church going to use its money? And that's really how this is manifested. But the core issue is a matter of interpretation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. So I know that was a lot. And for some of you, this is like, well, who cares? But any thoughts and questions about this? Because, this is in our town, right? There's a church down the road that we don't interact with. And I wish we did. And there's a rend there in fellowship. And so maybe it's something we need to put some more work into fixing. But any thoughts? We got 2 minutes.
Seems as though if it was wrong for the church, it'd be wrong for the individual.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, there's a real serious disconnect there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is an aspect of the church is a collection of individuals. And so there is a distinction between an individual and a corporate body. And so the church is the corporate body. And, I don't understand what you're saying, but that's...
Do they not pay their preacher?
They
don't know how he's going to use that money.
Well, that's some don't. And so that was a big, especially in the 60s. You've probably heard of one-cupper churches. Not all non-institutionals are one-cup churches, but all one-cup churches are non-institutional. And same thing with, not all non-institutional churches are one cup, but I'll say most one cup are non-institutional. So, and the same thing is true about back in the 60s. There's a really big movement against Bible schools, Bible school and church. And there's still in Texas particularly, there's a large group of non-institutional churches that say it's not authorized to have a Bible class. All worship must be done corporately, together. It's not right to divide into these small groups, and so that's another issue. Another issue was paying preachers. That was a big issue, and so yeah.
How do they feel about paying for the bill or renting the building they worship in?
Yeah, well, they say that the building is a necessity. It's you need a place to meet, and so the building should only be used for spiritual things. And so you can justify paying for a building because the building is the place where the spiritual things occur. And so it's an expedience in that matter.
It makes me think of that billboard where you've got the horse and everything, cats, dogs, and then you've got cows and chickens. Where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Where
It's
you draw the line.
I don't draw that line. Yeah, Claire.
I've heard people say too, it's easier to shake the right hand than the left. And so to them, we are on the left. and to
Yeah.
us, they're on the right.
Yeah, and Doug Burleson's done a lot to kind of try and mend this, and he says all the time it's easier to shake the right hand of fellowship than the left, and that's definitely true. I have a much easier time shaking their hand than they do shaking mine, and so yeah. Next week we're going to address some of these things and talk about this a little bit more from our perspective. So. The things I'm saying here, these are not my views. These are their views. Just don't go leaving here saying I said something I didn't say. So, all right. Thank you, guys.